scene. And good evening, everybody. May I start my presentation with this map by Laura Canali, which reminds us that at the beginning of the last century, Europe dominated the world. In other words, the world was European. Nowadays, Europe is dominated by global geopolitical dynamics it can no longer control. The European Union is not the global player it promised to become. On the contrary, it has embarked upon gradual disintegration. This is, in my view, a long-term geopolitical process that would be difficult to reverse for many reasons, but for one reason in particular. The fact is that we don't, as Europeans, we do not feel that we really share the same interests, and therefore tend to unload our problems to one another rather than address them together. This Europe is based on power relations much more than on common rules, and common rules are interpreted usually on the basis of the balance of power. Europe's geopolitical disintegration is the result of pressure coming both from external and from internal factors that are closely interconnected. We are not only faced with emergencies, we are in a sort of historical cycle at the end of which, probably before the end of next decade, the European continent's geopolitical map will differ greatly from the current one. In order to better understand the meaning and the extent of this transformation, it is best to set Europe within the global context. And so I go to the next map, which shows that Europe borders with what we call chaos land. At the center of the map, you can see this very broad part of our planet, which goes from Central America through most of Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Southern Asia. Chaos land is the part of the world brimming with the greatest instability factors, starting with the wars, terrorism, widespread poverty, environmental turmoil caused by climate change, and mass migration, and, which is most important in geopolitical terms, failing or failed states. We have in our atlases still states which do not exist anymore. Think of Syria, think of Libya, think of Afghanistan, think of Somalia, and the list is quite long. From an environmental perspective, chaos land is mostly set in the tropical crisis belt, where the impact of rising temperature is most marked. Here, even a minimum rise in the temperature can cause significant consequences for the environment. Added to wars and widespread poverty, climate change, by example, desertification and rising sea levels above all, is one of the driving structural factors of migration from Africa towards Europe. These factors contribute to the weakening or disintegration of states around Europe, or even within Europe. You see this map, which comes from an American think tank, depicting the states which are considered more fragile, and you see that it's quite a broad picture, and it's more or less corresponding to the space of chaos land. With its demographic decline and a median age of 42.5, Europe will thus be increasingly exposed to the dynamics of chaos land, particularly Africa, where the population continues to increase and the median age is 19.5. Nowadays, we Europeans, including Russians and Ukrainians, are a little more than 700 million, sporting toward a downward trend, while Africans are already 1.2 billion and will double their numbers by mid-century, and be 4 times as many by the end of the century. On a planet with more than 11 billion people, only 600 or something more will be European. Furthermore, in a world in which, for the first time in history, more people live in cities than in rural areas, and destined to concentrate in megalopolises, which in some cases may be more important than the states they will nominally belong to, perhaps only 2 cities in the current European Union, this one, London, and maybe Paris, will be part of this league. A continent with few and elderly inhabitants cannot easily coexist with a populated and young world pushing at its gate. This also for psychological reasons. Old people don't take risks normally, nor grasp new opportunities. On the Eastern Front, Europe is up against 2 unstable and intrinsically revisionist powers, Russia and Turkey. These are actually 2 former empires determined to resume their previous standing. They are both declining, but precisely for that reason, they are more unpredictable. Europeans are above all divided on how to approach Russia, with a kind of northeastern front led by the UK, Sweden, Poland, going to Romania, which is clearly anti-Russian, an ambiguous Germany, while some countries in Western and Southern Europe, including Italy, are far more open to Moscow. These internal dividing lines within NATO and the EU are all the more evident in the Ukrainian war. In any case, as you see from this map, 25 years ago the Russians were in Berlin, now they are fighting in eastern Ukraine. Quite a difference. Let us now concentrate on internal European dynamics. Our continent is structurally affected by a major geopolitical macro trend, its de-Westernization. One should never forget that the European project after World War II was a quintessentially American one. Its strategic aim was to contain both the Soviet Union and communism by drawing a firm line between East and West and committing the United States to its defense. From 1945 to 1991, the outcome was an American Western Europe. The founding pillars of the European communities, and later those of the EU, were those of NATO. This meant keeping America in, Russia out, and Germany down. A sober assessment of current geopolitical trends indicates that, first, the Americans are in a quite nationalist mood, refocusing their strategy towards the Asia-Pacific to confront China. The Russians are relatively back, and the Germans are by far Europe's #1 player. The coming Brexit is another relevant and very symbolic step towards the de-Westernization, de-Atlanticization, if you wish, of Europe. A possible outcome of this trend could be its Germanization. There are still many people in continental Europe, and maybe not only in continental Europe, who fear some kind of German dominance, well beyond its economic dimension. In my opinion, they are wrong. We will not experience a German Europe. At best, or worst, depending on your point of view, we will see the emergence of a German core, a geo-economic core, with some geopolitical features around the so-called Neuro, what the Germans call the Northern Euro, which is, by the way, an idea of the current finance minister, Mr. Wolfgang Schäuble. He spoke about that already in '94, of a kind of Euro core. This construction would embrace some states belonging to the industrial value chain, of Germany and sharing its monetary and fiscal culture. For example, Holland, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, some Scandinavian countries, and of course France, largely for geopolitical reasons. But Germany is essentially not an hegemonic power, one which would be able to unite and lead Europe. This for one main reason, its self-centered economic structure. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. In the German case, you cannot build a geopolitical sphere of influence around a core country that structurally absorbs liquidity, exports deflation, and thus weakens its favorite export markets, the European partners. By insisting on running a persistent surplus with everybody else, Germany is stimulating conflicts in the Eurozone and exacerbating Germanophobia. This is not the way leading countries normally build a hegemonic sphere of influence. In 4 words, Germany is not America, or should I add, is not what America was. So far, there is no German grand strategy. At the same time, growing economic power inevitably brings about more geopolitical responsibilities and temptations. This is why Berlin is set to strengthen its military power. So, as a kind of conclusion of this geopolitical analysis, and then I'll leave the floor to my friend Brunello, the algebraic sum of the 2 major geopolitical trends, de-Westernization and non-Germanization of Europe, at the very best may bring about a balance of power in Europe. At worst, an almost anarchic continent. We can safely say that history has returned to Europe, which was precisely what the EU was meant to avoid. Welcome back to a quite unbalanced balance of power Europe. But let me be clear, we will not experience an absolute return to the past. As Mark Twain put it, history never repeats itself, but it rhymes. And remember, any disintegration is as such, at the same time, a reintegration, producing different geopolitical landscapes, borders, and patterns. In fact, we are already seeing a reconfiguration of the distribution of power along new and old lines due to some degree of commonality among different players at the national, regional, or even local level. I told you about the German core. One may speak about the anti-Russian coalition, etc., etc. But we should not fool ourselves. Like it or not, non-Europe will profoundly affect the future of post-Brexit Britain, and vice versa. We may not belong to the same club, but history and geography bind us together. In other words, we face a common destiny. Why should we not try to shape it together? I leave the answer to my friend Brunello.